Monsieur, dames, bonjour. À cette deuxième journée de notre colloque consacré aux relations entre la sculpture et le tissu, à l'occasion de l'exposition Magdalena Abakanowicz au Musée Bourdelle, nous sommes dans les locaux temporaires de l'Institut polonais de Paris et j'ai l'honneur d'ouvrir cette deuxième journée. Je voudrais surtout vous dire que la visite du musée hier de l'exposition n'était pas possible pour des raisons techniques, mais on vous invite, surtout le musée, mais on vous invite ensemble de voir cette exposition cet après-midi à 17h30 au Musée Bourdelle. Donc pour ceux qui n'ont pas vu l'exposition, qui souhaitent la voir aujourd'hui, il y a cette possibilité à 17h30 au Musée Bourdelle. Donc on pourrait tous un peu aller ensemble de l'Institut à l'issue de la conférence. Et donc, on passe tout de suite au premier panel. Donc, la première présentation sera faite par Madame Sandra Imko, qui est doctorante en histoire de l'art, affiliée à l'université de Lausanne et à l'université catholique de Lublin, Jean-Paul II. Elle prépare une thèse sur l'art textile polonais de la seconde moitié du XXe siècle, avec l'accent particulier sur la participation de la New Tapestry polonaise au Biennale de Lausanne entre 1962 et 1995. Ces recherches questionnent les relations entre textile, mémoire collective, matérialité et sensorialité. Et elle va nous présenter aujourd'hui une présentation intitulée Tapestry and Transformation, Reframing and Origin of the New Tapestry in Poland.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here today and to open the day with my presentation. And what I want to do is challenge a story that has been told again and again, that the Polish New Tapestry was born out of folk traditions, and to propose an alternative path of understanding. When I started this research some years ago, I also believed it. It is repeated in almost every publication, so it seemed true. But the more time I spent looking at the real folk weavings, the more this idea fell apart. I visited ethnographic museums, I examined digital collections, compared rural textiles with the works of Abakanowicz, Owicka and Sadley. And it became rather clear that they shared very little. If there was something folk in those post-war works, it wasn't in the technique, the patterns, or even in the material. It was a way of thinking, a specific moral idea about truth and work. And what's interesting is that this idea didn't originate in socialist Poland, even though the government was fond of everything folk, but it began much earlier, at the start of the 20th century, and solidified during the interwar years. At the time, Poland did not exist as a state, and artists sought to preserve national identity through art. This search for national style took a distinctly patriotic tone. It also drew on John Ruskin's idea about moral value of craft. However, in Poland, there was no significant industrial revolution that shattered or caused the decline of craft. So Ruskin's ideas took a different form. They met with our own romantic writers, most importantly the poet Cyprian Kamil Norwid, who wrote that beauty should exist in every object and that art must grow from the truth and goodness, and that inspiration comes from the people. These ideas inspired several generations of artists. They were the foundation of Ład Cooperative, founded in 1926 by artists who also prepared the Polish pavilion for 1925 Paris exhibition. Those artists believed in what they called truth of the material, claiming that the peasant understood this truth naturally, that they walked honestly with their hands and respected the material, which meant to honor its innate values, innate characteristics. But this was more a projection than a fact about vernacular culture. As anthropologist Eva Klekot later explained, these artists didn't really continue folk traditions. They reinvented them, simplified, stylized, and adapted for the urban middle class. It was folk art made for city apartments. A perfect example of this is Eleonora Plutyńska, known in the West as the Grande Dame of Polish tapestry. Before the war, she walked with Watt and was famous for saving double warp technique from Podlasie region. In truth, the local weavers never stopped using it, but she didn't like their modern designs or modern dyes. So she brought them old photographs of Eastern tapestries, and she considered noble. And the weaver began producing those for Warsaw clients while continuing their own modern designs for their own work to have in their homes. After the war, the socialist state also loved that story. Folk art aligned perfectly with its ideology, the art of the people, honest, collective, and also healthy. In 1959, Ksawery Piwocki published Tkanina Polska, Polish Tapestry, a book that presented Polish tapestry as direct continuation of folk tradition. And a few years later, Krystyna Kondratiuk, who led Polish delegation to the Lausanne Biennale, printed a small leaflet that repeated a similar story. It was given out freely to the visitors. It was the only national delegation to do so, and it was a brilliant move to present Poland as modern, but also deeply rooted in peasant authenticity. Of course, Western critics also loved that narrative. Since 18th century, Eastern Europe has been perceived as the other Europe, characterized as backward and often uncivilized. So when Polish artists arrived in Lausanne in 1962, with their hand-woven, uneven and rough forms, Western critics didn't really know what to do with them. And compared to refined, elegant tapestries of Jean-Luc Sap, Polish works appeared wild and were in fact called barbaric. But very soon this barbarism became a compliment. Polish artists were praised for their intuitive and spontaneous approach, and the folk label made them easier to understand and also easier to admire from a safe cultural distance. This story lasted because it worked for everyone. For the artists, it gave them moral depth. For the critics, it explained the difference, and for the state, it was perfect propaganda. Poland looked modern, but still pure, rooted and socialist. So here we are today. On one side, the interwar myth of folk art as the soul of the nation, and on the other hand, the Western exotic view of Poland as naturally folk. Between these two sides, the artist of the new tapestry inherited a story, one that still shapes how their work is remembered today. I want to examine the Polish new tapestry from a different perspective. If not folk art, then what? What truly shaped new tapestry was not folklore, but the post-war artistic and social reality of Poland. To understand it, we must place it within this context, the rebuilding, the shortages, and the search for meaning that defined life after 1945. The war shattered the cultural order so completely that no tradition, however vital it might have been before, could simply continue. All fields of art, including tapestry, had to begin again. As art historian Marcin Lachowski argued, post-war art in Poland was a re-evaluation of previous ideas in the shadow of catastrophe. He does not mention tapestry in his research, but the process he describes fits it perfectly. New tapestry was a re-evaluation of the pre-war Watt cooperative ideas, and its ideas of truth of the material and the concept of listening to it. Watt tapestries were neat, flat, tightly woven and rational. The weaver executed the artist's design. Killing technique also reinforced this rational, controlled order. Listening to the material for those artists meant controlling it. After the war, this understanding collapsed. Although kilims were still made, they were no longer the central focus. Artists such as Krystyna Wojtyła-Drouet, Magdalena Abakanowicz and Jolanta Owicka began to listen to the material quite differently. The thread was no longer a flat line, but a living three-dimensional substance. Respecting it meant allowing it to expand, twist, thicken, and enter the space. What happened here was not only a formal innovation, it was also a profound shift in the philosophy of the making. The pre-war belief in order and in logic, the rational beauty of structure and order, no longer made sense. How could logic explain the war? How could order be trusted after such meticulously planned destruction? Post-war artists, consciously or not, turn away from the logic. They turn towards the body. To weave meant to trust one's hand, to rely on the rhythm, on the repetition, and on time itself. Long hours spent with yarn between one's fingers, a slow process of binding and connecting, became a quiet act of reconstruction. Phenomenology also helps to articulate this shift. Following Maurice Merleau-Ponty, creation begins in the body. Many of these artists were children or adolescents during the war, and touch was the only form of knowledge that remained reliable. The experience of bombings, hunger, fear, and loss shaped the way they worked, and even if it was subconsciously. The new tapestry was not born from folklore. It was born from the body, from the trauma, and from the need to remake the world through touch. To remake the world was part of post-war reality in Poland. The country had to rebuild physically, politically, and symbolically, and it was rebuilt as a socialist state that promoted collective modernization, social equality, and idea of new beginning. What became central in this process was the notion of modernity, as we call it nowoczesność. In Polish art history, this term designates a set of tendencies that emerged both against tradition and against socialist realism. Modernism, as Wojciech Włodarczyk wrote, is a way of life, a social attitude. Its elements are space, cultural and social context. It also, of course, is progress, dynamism, innovation and sense of the rhythm, and the inevitability of change. One of the traditional legacies that nowoczesność positioned itself against was Polish colorism, or decapism, a movement shaped by French post-impressionism and focus on color as the central problem of art. After the war, artists associated with colorism regained influence at the reopened academies, and their pedagogy strongly marked the new generation. Although colorists work mainly with the figurative painting, they believe in the autonomy and the expressive power of color opened the way towards abstraction. Paradoxically, from these traditional studios came exceptional post-war artists. Among them was Jolanta Owicka, who reinterpreted the colorist heritage in the medium of tapestry. Color remained her primary concern, not as decoration, but as a structural principle. Like the colorists, she used color to organize the image, to build a rhythm and to an internal balance. We can see that her work referenced the landscape, but it's really pushed toward abstraction. She brought colorist lessons into the material realm of weaving, making fiber itself the active participant in the chromatic play. The green surface is smooth and cohesive, and the white busts outwards, fluffy and luminous. In her work, color generates form, often aiming for the third dimension. Here are more examples of Owicka color masterpieces. Another one of most distinctive expressions of Polish modernity in the 1950s was matter painting, which we call malarstwo materii. It was not a formal movement, but rather a cluster of different aspiration, experiments, and artistic attitudes. In matter painting, artists use unconventional, often humble materials: sand, paper, textiles, found objects, and fragments of everyday life. What united artists working in this tendency was a shared desire to rethink what painting could be. These works privileged the senses over the vision, touch over the representation. They are obviously very solemn and definitely trauma-coded, but they embody a haptic understanding of the world, a tactile search for a reality through matter. This shift also reflected the material conditions of post-war Poland. Artists' work with what they had, poor found objects, became means of expressions. Scarcity itself turned into an aesthetic principle. Textiles appear in many of these works, but most powerfully in the practice of Jadwiga Maziarska, one of the most important precursors of matter painting in Poland. Maziarska exemplified the re-evaluation of modernism that defined Polish art at the time, the move toward embodiment from the intellectual to the material. Maziarska's work is not only a pioneering example of matter painting, but also a significant contribution to the field of textile art. As a side note, I'd like to show you her scène work, as it marks the very beginning of the lineage of contemporary tapestry in Poland. Here both of her early works, Common Link and An Automatic Reason, were a turning point in how fabric entered artistic thinking. Maziarska abandoned the modernist idea of the pure medium. Instead, she incorporated fragments of textile materials into her paintings, transforming them into bodily charged pictures. Here I compare Maziarska with Abakanowicz. Her work exemplifies painting as a place of reimagining tradition, where the world is depicted through analogies with material of haptic qualities, wax, sand, and found objects. She makes the surface come alive, thicken, and those are analogies, analogical processes to those happening in tapestry. The new tapestry is starting around 1958. In 1958, when matter painting is still a vital formula, so it makes a lot of sense to put them together and search for meanings in the fact that those canvases and those warps are gaining structure, volume, and we can even say that they gain body. The next very important part of the modernity as a project is spatiality. As art historian Wojciech Włodarczyk noted, modernity in post-war Poland was understood as an artistic current seeking harmony between art and contemporary civilization. It gave rise to what he called a spacious art or spatial art, practices oriented towards the space and social environment. Spatiality became a key concept of 1950s, visible in matter painting, which pushed beyond the flat canvases, but also in tapestry. Here I present you a pioneering work of Polish textile art made by today entirely unknown artist Hanna Dąbkowska, which she, as early as 1961, reimagined the relations of space within textile. I think it resonates very well with works of Leonora Toni that were made around similar time. And however, the concept of spatiality developed most fully within the community of architects and the artists of Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, as we yesterday saw. And here it is worth to bring two concepts: Oskar Hansen's theory of open form, which proposed that the artists and architects should not impose composition, but create frameworks that remain open to human presence and participation. And equally important was the integrationalist model promoted by Jerzy Sołtan and Bogdan Urbanowicz, which called for the coexistence of painting, sculpture, architecture, design, and also textile within a shared spatial environment. This sets the stage for rethinking tapestry as an art form not bound to two-dimensional wall. And to prove that textile artists were well aware of this tendency, I provide examples of exhibitions that were made along these concepts, like 1960, Owicka, groundbreaking show in Zachęta, designed by Zofia and Oskar Hansen, as well as her later shows. Textiles could be open, interactive, and spatial. Those concepts, they clearly resonate with the works of new tapestry. There was a certain courageousness in these ideas about the possibilities of art and architecture. And they profoundly influenced Warsaw-based artists of the time, expanding the notions of what art could be. A parallel development to textile art can be found in sculpture, which is our next point of departure, specifically in the works of Alina Ślesińska. Alina Ślesińska was inspired by Sołtan teaching and the Hansen's open form concept, and she moved from biomorphic sculptures, reminiscence of Barbara Hepworth or Henry Moore, towards visionary projects that connected sculpture, architecture, and the city. And her sculptures, as art historian Marta Leśniakowska observed, were rooted in abstraction and matter painting. And here I quote, "The iron logic of right angles," as she wrote, dissolves in Ślesińska work into soft, porous, dough-like forms of living architecture that brutally reveal its anatomy, in face of biological decay. Ślesińska crossing of boundaries between sculpture and architecture mirrors that shifts in textile art. Just as she reimagined sculptures, weavers such as Abakanowicz and Łaszkiewicz expanded textile into three-dimensional forms. Sculpture and textile were driven by the same impulse toward integrating the inside and the outside, to exceed the limits of the medium and to occupy space materially, conceptually, and socially. Yes, this is intentionally blank. And to end, the phenomena I discussed today are crucial for understanding Polish textile art, not only because they share certain formal qualities, above all the search for space within fiber and the spatial construction art is created from it, but because they emerged from a specific, situated post-war knowledge that enabled experimentation within a discipline traditionally linked to craft and associated with women work. This is, at its core, a story about crossing boundaries of the medium, of social position, and of moving from the domestic towards the public. What I presented here is, of course, only a fragment of larger field that has long been treated as peripheral. Yet the relations between Polish new tapestry and wider artistic developments offer a rich terrain for further research, especially when viewed through the transformations of artistic media in the 1960s and later, for example, the tension that happened in the 1970s when sculpture turned toward dematerialization while textile art continued to gain physical presence. This is, of course, not to claim that textile art is equal to other disciplines. We are past this discussion, but to show that textile art was part of the same world, one that was marked by deep transformation of social and political order. And that's it from me, and thank you.
Un grand merci. Thank you so much. Je pense que pour beaucoup de parmi vous, c'était une découverte de pas mal d'artistes. Pas mal d'entre elles sont très connues aujourd'hui en Pologne, mais ce n'était pas toujours le cas. Les questions seront plus tard. Pytania będą po następnym referacie.